So once again, we are in Genesis 50. And so, as we read in this text and as you might have heard through the children's sermon, this isn't like a topical sermon. And what I mean by that, this isn't necessarily a sermon where we chose a topic and picked a verse. Rather, this was the verse chosen. These were the passages chosen. But a dominant theme emerges. And it's something called providence. Okay? Specifically God's providence. And I'm going to quickly explain what that means, which is that it is the doctrine that God actively, wisely, and lovingly governs, upholds, and directs everything. All events throughout the universe to fulfill his purposes. And so I want to be clear, this isn't simply the idea that things don't happen by chance. Okay, it's not just this idea that God is in complete control. Rather, that God is in complete control and he uses his sovereignty to work all things for good, for those called according to his purpose, as we read in Romans 8:28. But what is our experience of God's providence? For me, and maybe for many of us as well, our experience of the doctrine that we just read, our experience of what we call God's providence, a lot of times sounds like these questions. Why is this happening? God, why is this happening and why now? Or maybe even, why isn't this happening? Why not now? I feel like a lot of times this is actually how we feel about God's providence. This is our personal experience when it comes to God working all things for good. It's questions that arise in our hearts, and whether we're believers or not this morning, when we have questions like these in our hearts, things like, why is this happening? If we're asking with any expectation of an answer, then whether we know it or not, we are actually posing these questions to God. If we have any expectation of an answer when we ask these things, then we're posing these questions to God. And so as we do that this morning, that's why we come to God's word. And the thing is, when you and I come to the word of God, we never come as a blank canvas. We don't approach the Bible in a vacuum. Because again, whether we want to or not, you and I are coming with these kinds of questions, or with our burdens, with our thoughts, our sufferings, our experiences, our joys, our bitterness. We're not coming empty. We're actually coming filled with either a lot of hurt, a lot of questions. And so maybe for many of us today, there is a question that we're bringing as we hear the word of God this morning. And maybe that question is, what is God doing? We're looking at our lives, and the question in our hearts is, what is God doing? And so as we try to answer this question, we're going to examine the life of Joseph. More specifically, we're going to slowly make our way through verses 19 through 21 of Genesis 50. But in doing so, we're pretty much going to end up walking through most of Joseph's life. And all the while, as we examine Joseph's life, again, we're going to be trying to answer this question throughout our sermon today. What is God doing? And so we'll start right in verse 19. And it says, but Joseph said to them, and we'll stop there. We're going to already stop, but Joseph said to them, because we're actually entering the story at the very end. And so you and I, we need a little bit of character introduction. We got to talk about the people who are in these verses, Joseph and them. Who is talking and who is he talking to? And so a little bit of background on Joseph. His story in Genesis starts in chapter 37, and we're told he's 17. So he's a young guy, and he's a pretty foolish, self-centered kid. It's not totally his fault. Admittedly, a lot of it has to do with his dad, Jacob, who has been renamed Israel. And I'll explain why he's foolish in a little bit. But he kind of has this mentality. He lives his life if there was a banner over Joseph's life, it would be this. It's about me. Life is about me. Joseph is by far the father's favorite, to the point where Jacob makes for him this beautiful robe and has him wear it every day as a constant reminder to everybody that Joseph is the favorite son. And Joseph leans into this a little bit. And the reason why I think that is because in verse 2 of chapter 37, we read that Joseph brings a bad report of his brothers to his father. It means Joseph is basically being sent out like a supervisor, even though he's the youngest, to see what his brothers are doing. And then he comes back and he snitches. He gives a bad report. He has a really low emotional IQ. And again, I'm going to explain more of why Joseph is so foolish for being this way. Okay, but the one last thing you need to know about Joseph is that he has these dreams. Specifically, these two dreams where basically he has visions that his 11 brothers are bowing down to him. And so now we'll talk about the brothers. This is who Joseph is talking to in verse 19 today. It's these brothers, and they hate Joseph. Like they're just so sick of him. This guy who is their father's favorite son, who's obnoxiously the father's favorite. But what you and I sometimes forget, what I forgot, is that these brothers, they're literally brothers from another mother. They don't have the same mom as Joseph. Okay? If you guys know the backstory a little bit, there's family drama here that comes into the story. It doesn't actually mention in chapter 37, but there's backstory to this drama, okay? Jacob, a long time ago, he goes to work for his uncle Laban. And he works for 7 years so that he can marry his daughter Rachel. But what happens is he works for 7 years and Laban instead gives him Leah, the older sister. And so Jacob doesn't want Leah, he wants Rachel, and so he works for another 7 years to marry the woman he actually wants. And the reason why this matters is because Jacob has a favorite wife, and it's not Leah. But these 11 brothers, their mom is Leah, and Joseph's mom is Rachel. So it's not just the fact that these brothers are sick of this kid who just relishes being the father's favorite. It's the fact that this is the favorite son of the favorite wife of the father who doesn't love their mom. Okay, and their moms hate each other. Leah and Rachel hate each other. And so we're actually stepping into a generational drama here, okay? And maybe this might, if you and I have heard the story of Joseph before, this might actually help us understand why these brothers just are so sick of Joseph. It's this guy who has like no sense. He knows that their moms hate each other. He knows that he is the favorite son of the favorite wife. And so he brings bad reports of his brothers to their dad. And then he comes downstairs and he's like, hey, by the way, I had a dream that you guys are all going to bow down to me. So Joseph, at this point in the story, understandably, is pretty insufferable. Part of it, this is like inherited bitterness in their family. And so this is the background, okay, of Joseph and his brothers. And so what they do, because they're so sick of him, is they conspire to get rid of him. Originally, they mean to kill him, but what they end up doing is they sell him into slavery. And then you fast forward 14 years to our text today, where now these 11 brothers who sold Joseph into slavery are bowing before the prime minister of Egypt. They're bowing before the second most powerful man in one of the most powerful empires in the world. And it is Joseph. It is the brother that they sold into slavery. And so again, I said throughout this sermon, we're going to be asking this question: what is God doing? Okay? And I'm going to offer our first answer. What is God doing? And our first answer today is restoration. God is restoring. This was a broken family. We just talked about how this was a family with generational, deep-rooted bitterness and hatred. And I don't think any of us could have guessed that the way this family would begin their journey towards reconciliation was by having the brothers sell Joseph into slavery. I know none of us would have made that leap. None of us would have thought, the beginning of their journey into reconciliation is to sell their brother into slavery. There's just no way you and I would think that. Because from a human perspective, if we were in their shoes, we would actually think this is the end. This is the final straw. And now this family is too far gone. How do you come back from something like this? Now this family is too far broken. And you know what? Maybe this is how some of us feel about not just our relationships, maybe not just about our families, but various situations in our lives, that things are just too broken, too far gone to be restored. Areas where you and I, for so long, just have not seen progress, change, healing for generations. But what God's providence means is that He is always at work. and he is always at work for good. And so even in the selling of Joseph into slavery by his brothers, God, in his wisdom, is actively unfolding a plan that would not only result in the restoration of this broken, generationally broken family, but also, as we heard in Jude's children's sermon, the preserving of basically the entire Mediterranean basin. God's providence also means that if he is not just at work in our individual lives, but he is at work in the world. And so what was God doing? What is the active work that God was doing across these 14 years between Joseph being sold into slavery and now? What was God doing to bring about the reconciliation of Joseph's family and the preservation of these many lives? And so this is another question, or this is another answer to our question, what is God doing? And the answer I want to offer here is character formation. Character formation. What would be necessary? What would be necessary to prepare Joseph for both reconciling with his family and leading the nation of Egypt? It's the formation of his character. It's the producing of godliness in Joseph. Again, 14 years passed between Joseph being sold into slavery and our text today. And during that time, Joseph, he got sold to a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And we read that the Lord was with him, and so Joseph was successful, and Potiphar placed him over his entire house. But then because Joseph would refuse to be seduced by Potiphar's wife, because Joseph refused to become an adulterer, he was framed and wrongfully thrown into Pharaoh's prison. But we read even in that Pharaoh's prison, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And so he's still doing the right thing, and the keeper places him in charge of the prison. And while he's there, Joseph correctly interprets the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. And he asks the cupbearer, he's like, hey, I'm like wrongfully in prison. So when you get reinstated, when you're back before Pharaoh, can you remember me? Can you mention me? But of course, the cupbearer forgets. And so Joseph remains in prison for years until eventually one day, Pharaoh has a vision and they need someone to interpret. But before then, I want you and I to imagine ourselves in Joseph's shoes. Throughout all these seasons where it feels like Joseph is doing the right thing, and yet, he is being framed. He is being forced to wait, and not just wait in a nice place, but wait in prison. And this question that might emerge in our hearts if we were in his shoes is, why is this happening? And again, maybe we don't even have to put ourselves in Joseph's shoes. Maybe already in our own lives, this is a question in our hearts. Why is this happening? Why now? Why not now? What is God doing? But, as we look back at Joseph's life, we can answer that question. We can see what God was doing. God was humbling Joseph, this foolish boy, teaching him that actually the most powerful and productive thing about him was that the Lord loved him. God was equipping Joseph for things like management, dealing with officers, politicians, people of power. God was disciplining Joseph into a man who valued obedience over reputation. God was maturing Joseph to be a man of patience who trusted in the Lord's timing and who had years to practice it. Years to practice what it looked like, what it felt like, and how hard yet how good it was to be faithful in the waiting. Until at long last, God had formed in Joseph the man he had always planned to raise up for the preservation of many lives. A man who could trust in the Lord and in his ways. A man who could say, happily, it's not about me. I hope this is an encouragement to some of us this morning who are wondering, what is God doing? Why not now? But you and I are being prepared. And prepared maybe not just for something like Joseph being in a position of power, but maybe specifically preparing us for being in a position of power before the people who have hurt us. In these ways, God was also preparing Joseph to be a man who now had the power, had the authority to exact vengeance on his brothers. His brothers are now bowing before him, just like he had envisioned, just like the dream he had had before. He is now standing as the prime minister of Egypt in front of the perpetrators of his suffering. But God has prepared him to say this instead. Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? If Joseph still had a heart that cried out, it's about me, if the banner of Joseph's life remained, it's about me, then this moment is ripe for vindication, for vengeance. This is the opportunity for Joseph to make them hurt the way he had been hurt. But God had been preparing his heart for 14 years for reconciliation. Joseph had learned to embrace and to rejoice in God's providence, and he's able to extend peace and blessing to his brothers because he knows God worked all things for good. Maybe that's happening for you and I, or for others right now. And as in that process, I do think it's important to highlight one thing. It's the order of our progression here. That the reason why Joseph was able to extend kindness towards his brothers and become someone God could use to save many people, it's not because he made it his mission to reconcile. Okay, it's not because he had set out to preserve the lives of people during famine. It's because over the course of 14 years, God was drawing Joseph's heart to himself. Okay? And so another answer I'd like to offer for this question, what is God doing? Is that God is drawing our minds to him. He's drawing our minds heavenward. God transforms us from people who believe it's about me to people who believe it's not about me, but it's not by making us first people who think it's about others. Okay, we don't go from a people who say it's about me to it's about others. First, you and I go from a people who say it's not about me to it's about God. And if you and I skip this step, if we try to skip into being people who are for others before we are first for God, then what's going to happen is when you and I look at other people, we are going to look at them in relation to what we are going through. We are going to look at them through the lens of our own situations, our own circumstances, instead of through the lens of who God is and what he's doing. And when you and I do that, when we look at other people's lives in relation to ourselves, it produces things like envy, it produces bitterness, it produces the inability to celebrate. And rather instead of things like compassion and joy, when we don't look at people through the lens of who God is and what he's doing, we can't be a people who extend reconciliation. We can't be a people who extend the goodness of Jesus because we are not heavenly minded. And so Joseph here, he's able to see the truth about God's providence. God has trained him to turn his mind heavenward. He's able to see the bigger picture. He's not caught up in what these 14 years have cost him. He's caught up in what God has produced through it. He's caught up in rejoicing that God brought it about that many people should be kept alive as they are to this day. And so, maybe what God is doing, if we have been in a season of waiting, in a season of longing, or of trial, or whatever long season we have been in, maybe, like Joseph, God is turning our minds heavenward in order that you and I might genuinely become a people whose hearts are for others. And, we mentioned that the bigger picture here was that through Joseph, through these 14 years of God preparing him to be a man that we read today, through it, God was able to save many. And so I just want to share a testimony I heard. So I had the opportunity to hear a testimony recently from an older man at another church. So don't try to, it's not somebody here. So he works in construction, and he was sharing how about 20 years ago, while on a job, he fell off a ladder and he really, really badly broke his leg. He and his wife and his daughter had just immigrated to the States about a year before this, and just nothing had been going according to plan. So they were actually in the process of getting ready to move back. They were getting ready to move back to Korea. But then this happened. And it wasn't just that he broke his leg, but he was told that it was likely he'd be disabled for the rest of his life. And so just imagine, even as I was listening, he's the primary breadwinner for his family. And now he's unable to work, potentially forever. They were in the process of moving back to Korea, which now had to be put on hold indefinitely. And so just imagine what kind of questions would have gone through his mind It's the same questions we've been asking. Why is this happening? Why now, God? What does this mean for my family? His wife had, gone to church and stuff, but he had never really gone to church before. But when he was in the ambulance, out of desperation, he prayed this prayer. It's kind of a crazy prayer. But he said, God, if you let me walk again, I'll serve you until I die. It's a pretty wild prayer. We talked about it at Praise and Prayer this past Friday. God takes promises pretty seriously. And so amazingly, maybe not to us, but amazingly, his leg recovers enough for him to be able to walk again. And he starts attending church and he meets the Lord. And, his wife had prayed that he would become a Christian. But I can guarantee that when all of this went down, that when nothing had been going according to plan, and then he broke his leg, was unable to work, I am sure that she did not see this as the answer to her prayer. That if anything, she probably saw it as, evil is prevailing over our lives. But God had actually even bigger plans than her prayers. Sure, she prayed that he'd become a Christian, but actually, and also encouraged by this, as a result of him becoming a Christian, his mother also then became a believer. And then later his father, who had always been a very staunch atheist, also became a believer. And then his sister-in-law, who had walked away from church, returned to the church. And then her husband, who is his older brother, who like their father had always been an atheist, also got saved. And that guy's, his older brother is also now an elder. And then, now their daughter was able to be raised in a Christian home. And funny enough, his daughter ended up marrying a pastor who I know is only able to minister or do the kind of ministry he does because of his wife. And the reason why I know that is because she's upstairs taking care of our baby. And so this is my father-in-law's testimony. And so I am reaping the benefits of God's providence over my father-in-law's life. If they had moved back to Korea, I don't have my wife. I cannot do ministry, and maybe there'd be no oak. There'd be no cherry. But if we think back 20 years ago when he was in that ambulance, and he's thinking, what is God doing? There's just no way that the answer that arises in his mind is, God is saving my marriage. God is saving my parents. God is bringing back my sister-in-law to the church and saving my brother. God is preserving our family for the next generation. God is preparing B1 to be my wife, or God is preparing him to become Cherry's grandfather. There's no way he was thinking these things. If anything, he was probably thinking, God is ruining my life. God is burdening my family. God is stopping us from trying to go back to Korea. But now 20 years later, he has this testimony. And he doesn't dwell upon what it cost him, but he rejoices in the good that was produced from it. Friends, sometimes, actually almost always, and I hope this is an encouragement to us, what's happening in our individual lives is not just about us. It is about those God is blessing or is going to bless through us. Sometimes what's happening right now in our lives is to bring about that many people should be saved, as they are to this day. And one thing I want us to notice, just through my father-in-law's testimony, but even through the life of Joseph, is that we keep asking this question, what is God doing? But the only way we were able to get an answer to that is by looking back at what God has done. And I mention this because even as we hear all of this, sometimes we can still doubt God is working. The way that we've been hearing in the sermon, sometimes we might still doubt that God is working like that in my life. And it's not always just the lack of evidence, but we might think it's the lack of reason. We might look at ourselves and we might ask, why would he for someone like me? I understand why God would work in the life of someone like Joseph. But why would he work like that in my life? And we don't know how to wait until the day. Maybe we don't know how to wait for 20 years where we can look back at our own lives and see God's faithfulness. And so one of the final answers I want to offer to us this morning is, what is God doing? God is giving grace to sinners. In our final passage, in our final verse this morning, I think what usually strikes us most about these verses is the way Joseph responds to his brothers. Right? That's probably it's something that moves us. The way Joseph is able to respond to the people who betrayed him. But the reason why it's so striking is it's because it's not really about Joseph, right? What's so striking about Joseph in this moment is his Christ-likeness. It's how much he resembles Jesus Christ. And I know so far you and I have gleaned a lot of wisdom from the life of Joseph so far, but I'd like to remind us of something here. This is a historical text about historical people. And so how is it that you and I can find this text about ancient Hebrew people relevant to you and I? And it's because this word is for the people of God. And if you and I are the people of God, it is by the grace of Jesus Christ. And so if you and I recognize that this text is only relevant to us as recipients of the grace in Christ, and if in Joseph we recognize his Christ likeness in this narrative, then you and I should understand that you and I are likely more similar to the ones in this narrative who are also recipients of grace from this Christ-like figure. What I'm basically trying to say is that most times, friends, you and I are not Joseph. Most times you and I are the brothers. When you and I read this story, if you and I think that we are Joseph, there are times that you and I are where it feels like our lives are not up to us. It feels like our lives are in the hands of other people. It feels like we don't know what God is doing and we can't see the end of this journey. But also, I don't want us to leave this morning thinking that you and I are simply recipients of God's providence as people who are entitled to it, but even as people who are entitled to wrath, even as people who are entitled to punishment, to vengeance. We are part of God's providence. We are the brothers. We are recipients of grace. Just like the Pharisees, fellow sons of Israel, could not bear the thought of bowing down to Jesus, the true Son, we are the ones who, maybe in our insecurity, maybe in our selfishness, we would sell Jesus away for our comfort. And so, we should recognize that we don't deserve God's providence. We don't deserve to have God actively working all things for good, for our good, but he is, because that is what he does. And if we doubt that, then we don't just have to look at the brothers. We don't just have to look at the life of Joseph. You and I can look to the cross, where by the death of the Son of God at the hands of sinners, grace was extended to the very ones who put him there, which is you and I, so that many might be saved. And not just the ones who are like Joseph, but even the ones who are like the brothers, the wretched, the ones who are full of bitterness, the ones who are in need of grace. You and I are eligible to be recipients of God's providence, no matter what. And it's because, and this is my final point, and it's because of this, the final answer to the question that we might be asking in our hearts and in the Word this morning: what is God doing? The answer, now and always, he is exalting his Son, Jesus Christ. In this final answer, we actually have summed up every answer that you and I have uncovered from the text today. When God is restoring the things that we thought were far too broken, God is exalting Christ, the one through whom we have reconciliation with God and one another. When God is conforming us to the image of his Son, God is forming our character. God is displaying how restoration comes from the abiding presence and power of Christ in us. And we read in Romans 8 that it is in fact for conformity unto Christ that God works all things together for good, in order that Christ may be exalted. And God transforms us by the renewal of our minds, first making us heavenly minded so that we might be of earthly good, and that through the good works that God produces in us, he might save many. And that, yes, even for sinners like you and I, the very ones who betray Jesus every day, there is grace, that God's providence is for you and me to magnify even further the amazing grace in Jesus Christ. That God works all things together for good, for the bad. it is not only that God works evil for good, God works over and against our evil for our good. And so for that reason and for so many more, I hope even in the midst of whatever seasons you and I might be in, that there is reason for hope, that there is reason to endure. There is reason to allow God to continue to work in and through us, to show us and to prove to us that we might become witnesses that he is indeed the God who works all things for good. And as you and I cling to this, as you and I direct our eyes heavenward, more and more you and I will become not just people like Joseph, but more and more you and I will become people like Christ. People in whom there is an unending joy, an unshakable steadfastness because of the hope we have in God.